Well, hi everybody, this is Gail again. This is episode 2 of our series on the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this one I'm going to entitle, Who is this woman? Well, last time I talked to y'all, I was a little guy and I was going back and forth from Fort Worth to San Antonio to Fort Worth with my dad. And during this time, my dad took some money and made his own record company. That's right. He formed Sharp Records. And this Sharp Records was the sermons of a well-known preacher at the time named J. Frank Norris. Now, J. Frank Norris was something else, and books have been written about him. In fact, he killed a man in his office one time, but you can look that up. You can Google it on J. Frank Norris. Now, during this time of going back and forth between San Antonio and Fort Worth and San Antonio, my grandparents had gained custody of me at one point, and I was enrolled for kindergarten and first grade in a Lutheran school in San Antonio, a Lutheran school. And part of the things I remember about that is I was in a play at the school, and I think I was a sheep or something. It was a Christmas type play, and then from there I went to Athens Elementary School for second and third grade in San Antonio. Now, I remember while in the second grade, there was a teacher named Ms. Tribble, and, my grandmother called her Ms. Trouble. And one time, she set me on her knee in the classroom and forced, that's my dog, Pierce, he's my little buddy, and forced me to eat a rotten banana, where I thought it was rotten, and I hated bananas for many, many years after that. At this time, I liked bananas again, but anyway, she made me eat that rotten banana. And we would say the Pledge of Allegiance in school, and we would have a little prayer. And that was when prayer was still allowed in school. So I'd go to the lunchroom, and I remember it was rather large, and eat my lunch. Now, at the time, my grandparents would take me to school in their car, and they had an old car from like the early 50s, and I remember it being round and black. And I used to be so terrified for them to take me to school. I didn't want to be seen in that old round black car. I kept asking them to get a square car. Please get a square car. Well, then the third grade, I remember one day in particular, I was at school and they let school out early in the afternoon. And it turned out that it was November 22nd, 1963, the day Kennedy was assassinated. And I was walking home. My grandmother didn't pick me up. I was walking home, not far. And I was walking with a little girl. And I remember asking the little girl, I said, well, who's going to be president now? Now, I didn't know anything about presidential succession or anything else. And she said, Johnson. Well, I didn't have a clue who Johnson was. So over the next couple of days, I remember my grandparents had a little black and white TV that stood on a stand. And I remember seeing JFK's funeral on that black and white TV. And I'll never forget that. It's sort of like 9/11. Where were you when on 9/11? Well, that's where I was on November 22nd, 1963. So Lyndon Johnson became president. And I remember back then I wrote Lyndon Johnson a letter and I asked him for his autograph. And they sent back a little booklet about him and a letter that said, well, he doesn't give out autographs, but that was that. So then, a little time after this, before I started the 4th grade, I remember my dad coming to the house one day, to my grandmother's house. And we'd been out shopping. We'd gone to 5 or 6 grocery stores, like I told you yesterday. And we'd been shopping, and we came home and went in the house. And in a few minutes, here came my dad. Well, yeah, I'm glad to see my dad. But then he had a woman with him. And I was a shy little guy. And, I went to my grandmother. And this woman turned out to be my dad's secretary at the time, and he had met her in Fort Worth, Texas at a rescue mission. And she had had problems. She was married, and then she was planning on getting a divorce. But, of course, I didn't know this at that time. So I met this woman. She tried to be pals with me and be friendly with me and help me and all that. And I remember I didn't want anything to do with it. So a little time after that, my dad moved with her to West Virginia. Now, she was born and raised in West Virginia. And at the time, they became romantically involved. I remember one time in San Antonio, before they moved up there, they took me to a church, and I didn't know what was going on, but they got married in that church, and my dad had divorced my maternal mom, Billy Sharp, at that time. And I remember, they took me on their honeymoon with them, and I think we went to California, went to Arizona, to the petrified forest and all of that. And I remember also the night this happened, that we were driving, and there were, some of y'all won't know what these are, but there were pots in a square that were guarding a hole. These pots were called smudge buckets, and they had a fire on the top of them. And this was the warning system in those days. Apparently, there was a big ditch dug, and they didn't want somebody falling in the ditch and drowning. So getting back to San Antonio, my dad moved with her. Her name was Retta Carroll Sharp. He moved with her to West Virginia. Then he came with her father, Presley H. Nutter, who had been a coal miner, and he was retired. They both showed up at my grandparents' house from West Virginia one day. Now, let me give you a little background on something. My grandfather, he would go to a medical arts building in San Antonio to get checked by his doctor, Dr. Boshart. Now, one time they took me with them. We went up the elevator, and when the elevator came down, it kind of jumped and jerked, and it scared the living daylights out of me. And I haven't liked rides or anything ever since. It gives me a feeling of terror. But anyway, so they came and they told me that I was going to go on a little trip with them to West Virginia. Now, I had it in my mind they were going to take me to New York and make me go on an elevator in the Empire State Building. And I screamed and hollered and said I would not do it. Well, long story short, I ended up going with them to West Virginia. I remember that my dad had this little travel trailer-like thing, and they'd gotten me a record, and it was a record about Popeye, a Popeye record, and I remember listening to that. I remember going to my, she was my stepmom, but she was mom, going to her sister's house in Nuttersport, West Virginia, and it was a two-story house. And I remember they had her sister and Oreen Sandy, who worked for Sears all her life. Well, it was her husband, Lynn, and their son, Lynn, and daughter, Lenarda Gay Sandy. And Lenarda was Narda to me. And like young 6, 7-year-old kids did, an 8-year-old, we'd get into a tussle and little skirmishes here and there and stuff like that. I'm sure Narda remembers this. She was 6 months older than me, and of course she was the smarter one and much better looking than me. So I went back to San Antonio for a time. You know, I want to go back to first grade. I remember my maternal mom, Billy Sharp, and my grandmother having me on my grandmother's bed one day, and they were teaching me to tie my shoelaces, and they were telling me how to make it a little rabbit ears and all that. I remember that quite fondly. But anyway, getting back to what I was talking about a minute ago, so they took me back to my grandmother's house in Texas, and then one day we got a phone call from West Virginia, and my grandparents talked to my dad a little bit, and then they put me on the phone, and he told me that they had a baby, and that the baby had lived about 24 hours a day, and the baby died. And the baby's name was J. Hamilton Sharp. In fact, I've been to his graveside within the last 6 years. But I didn't know that there was a baby, and I was quite shocked and quite upset by that. So after this, my grandfather built me a fort in the backyard. I mean, it was like 2 stories. It had a ladder up the top, had gun ports and everything else. And my friend from next door, David Mulholland, well, we had a Chinaberry tree. He'd come and attack the fort, and I'd grab those little balls from the Chinaberry tree, and I'd throw them at him. He'd throw stuff back at me, and I had a sandbox, and we'd get in the sandbox, and we'd throw sand in each other's eyes, and we'd scream and holler and fight, and then we'd be best friends again. One day, there was a kid, he was kind of a bully, if I remember, and he lived across the street. And I remember going across the street, and this kid had a bat, hit me right over the head with this bat. And I don't remember much after that, you know. So then after that, my dad came down again, and my grandmother said, well, she felt like he was ready to have me live with him full time. So they took me to West Virginia and took me to a lake. They had a house by a lake. It was called Lake Floyd. And I remember pulling up, and it was dusk dark, and going in, and the TV was on. It was in the basement. And I remember there was a show on about a dog called Rin Tin Tin. I remember that. And I remember during this time, I had my own little bedroom there in that house. One day I decided I was going to draw. I enjoyed drawing. So I found me a magic marker, went outside of the house, and I had wood paneling on the outside. And I went to the outside, and I was drawing all kinds of pictures with that permanent marker. Well, Retta Carroll Sharp, my mom, saw me doing this. And she impressed me that this was the wrong thing to do. I wasn't allowed to have a magic marker, I don't think, until I graduated from high school after that. And during the time, they put me in school, Van Horn School. Now, it was weird because I went to the schoolroom, and it was 2 grades in one room, 3rd grade and 4th grade in the room. And I was in 4th grade. And so there was a man teacher there, and he was teaching both classes. I remember that. I also remember I'd take the bus, but I really wasn't a good student. I was mad because I wanted to live in Texas with my grandparents. So I was terrible. And the teacher would send a note home about me not doing my work and all of that, and I got in trouble for that. I'll never forget that. And then at that school, now in San Antonio, there was no dancing, smoking, drinking, chasing wild women or anything else. So in this school, they had a class that was a dance class where you would dance a Spanish type dance and also a square dance type deal. And so I learned a little bit about that. And then I got really sweet on a girl there. That's right, sweet on a little girl. And would write her sweet notes and stuff like that. And I don't know whatever became of that. I really don't remember. Now, at the time, my dad was a pastor. He was pastoring a parish which consisted of 3 separate churches: Eden Baptist Church, Wilsonburg Baptist Church, and the Marshfield Baptist Church. I remember, and each Sunday he'd go to a different one and preach. I remember at Marshfield, it was a country church, and it was in the middle of the country, and there was a graveyard there. The windows would be up, and I remember sitting there, and I heard the song, in the garden for the first time that I remember. And I still remember every time I hear that song in the garden, I remember looking out that window at the trees, the mountains, and the graveyard. I'll never forget that. And then at Wilsonburg, I remember in that church, there was a man that was a printer. His name was Paul Hill. My dad became very close friends with him. Paul Hill printed me up, it must have been 500 pages that said, "From the desk of Gail F. Sharp." I've still got some examples of those pages today. And then at Eden, I remember that the Eden Baptist Church was under a bridge. And, I really don't remember that much about that church, but I remember it was under a bridge, and it's no longer there, as I understand. Now, I'm going to try later in an episode to show you pictures of all this stuff, that were taken, and of me in San Antonio and West Virginia and all that. And I think you'll find some of them interesting. And I remember one thing about Marshfield. You'd be going down a country road, barely one lane. And then all of a sudden you do a 180 turn and go up a gravel driveway at about a 45-degree angle up a hill to get to that church, so I remember that. But this is up to the 4th grade, and I guess I was a little rebel. I was a little stinker back then. And, I was just mad. I was a mad child because at the time I didn't want to be in West Virginia, and it was like being in a foreign country because lots of things were different. I was used to being in San Antonio and around flatter land, and all of a sudden I'm in a place with hills. I mean, we are talking hills. West Virginia is the mountain state. We are talking about hollers, like Butcher Holler type deals. And we're talking about snow. I remember when it snowed, and I would have to get boots, galoshes, to go over my regular shoes because of the snow. In fact, up there was a law that you had to get snow tires with sawdust in the wintertime back then, and all that happened. So that's about it on episode 2. I just wanted to give you a little insight about how the West Virginia living caught on and how I did that. And so until tomorrow, when we do episode 3, this is Gail saying good night and God bless y'all very richly. And if you have any comments or anything, let me know. And I'm also going to post this on my YouTube page. So give that a look too if you want to. All right. Well, good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.